First Sergeant Kep here with Company D, 2nd United States Sharpshooters, and thanks for joining us again in the workshop. Today I want to talk to you about a lacquer for small arms and for waterproofing paper. Now, I wanted to start this series of going more in depth into period paints, finishes, because we get so many questions from our viewers and people at events about how soldiers during the Civil War and how craftspeople during the Civil War actually finished their products. Now, looking back all these centuries later, we realize that many of what they used was toxic and contained many heavy metals that we would never consider using today. But if you want to follow along, I highly recommend the 1863 Ordnance Manual. This overlooked gem is available for free at places like Google Library and is full of all sorts of useful technical information, charts, recipes, diagrams that I think the curious reenactor would just eat up. Starting in chapter 7, you get into the paints and finishes and the recipes and how to prepare them. Now, it's also a really good exercise to kind of look up some of these old terms that are no longer used, but many of you would actually find a lot of these things familiar by their modern terms. And reading some of the preparation methods is kind of cringeworthy. The sort of the lack of safety that they exercise. I mean, some of these recipes involved boiling highly flammable liquids over an open fire for extended periods of time. Things that we would never consider doing today outside of a highly controlled laboratory environment. The other thing too is when you get into these sorts of finishes is to use caution and common sense. We know so much more now scientifically about caring for firearms, about caring for wood products than they did then. Some of the methods have been tried and true and tested throughout the generations to be a success, but I want to make sure that you go into this with some caution and maybe a sense of curiosity and very safe and controlled experimentation. A lacquer for small arms, for example, is very familiar to many of us. It is essentially a equal part mix of beeswax, boiled linseed oil, and turpentine. Some people substitute pure linseed oil, but the recipe from the Ordnance Manual does in fact call for boiled linseed oil. Many, if not all, military firearm stocks up until the M16 were finished in some form of boiled linseed oil. I also heard this lacquer well referred to as a Civil War version of cosmoline. And I suppose that if you put it on thick enough, it would create that nice wax barrier that would help prevent rust and corrosion for long-term firearm storage. Some people still use this on their firearms, on their wood stocks, either on revolvers, for example, and their rifles. Some love it, some hate it, so keep that in mind. I think probably one of the most common things people would complain about is the wax would leave either an uncomfortable or an unwanted, really smooth surface. Like all sort of naturally based finishes, they do require reapplication and maintenance, just like the old military rifles did with boiled linseed oil. The boiled linseed oil and turpentine and beeswax mix, I pretty much only use for my woodworking projects. I prefer using it in the solid form, which I apply with a rag. The boiled linseed oil really helps to bring out the grain in hardwoods, and the beeswax really adds a little bit of water protection and water resistance to the project. The turpentine, the smell does linger, so this kind of smells piney fresh. But I don't notice that the smell really lingers outside of the can. The turpentine helps to stabilize the mixture as it solidifies, and if you apply this mixture warm in a liquid state for waterproofing canvas or paper, the turpentine helps act as a penetrating agent to really seep into the fibers of whatever you're trying to waterproof. Now, of course, Boiled linseed oil is potentially dangerous, so you need to exercise caution and good safety practices. Boiled linseed oil soaked rags can spontaneously combust if cared for improperly. So make sure when you open up that can, you start soaking rags, you follow your safety precautions on the can, and you dispose of your rags cautiously. Normally what I do is I'll either soak them in water, or I'll lay them out on either concrete, or I'll just toss them into my fireplace, where if they catch on fire, it's no big deal because it's in the fireplace. But you can use this in multiple forms. Like again, go into it with a sense of experimentation and curiosity, and use plenty of common sense when experimenting with old finishes. This lacquer for small arms can be, like I said, found in chapter 7. And this particular recipe I got from page 173. You can see right there. Now, I like printing out the ebook versions of things, of reference materials that I use, so that way I don't have to worry about getting them dirty or damaged in my shop. And if I have, period correct printed versions in my Civil War desk, I don't have to worry about going up and digging them out every time I need to refer to them. So let's get into some of the stuff that you're going to need to mix this all together. You're going to need a heating surface of some sort. I always make this in my shop. I can just open up my shop door, get proper ventilation. Remember, whenever you burn propane, it creates carbon monoxide, so you need to make sure you have proper ventilation. A double boiler is necessary for melting your beeswax. I usually just use some Goodwill camping pots and melt down my beeswax that I get in chunks. You'll need boiled linseed oil, of course, turpentine, and a jar to mix it in. Now you can keep it in the jar that you mix it in if you choose. I actually like these tins. Captain Whitehall really got us into this company called Specialty Bottle. It's located up in Seattle, and they have for really inexpensive prices all sorts of different tin cans, different shapes and sizes. They also have glass and plastic bottles, and the shipping is very speedy. I like using the cans because when I run low, I can still get in there with a rag, and I don't have to worry about getting my fingers all the way down into the bottom of a mason jar, for example. And then lastly, you'll need something to stir everything with. So while you get all that together, I'm gonna move the camera and show you how I mix all this together. Now, when I get started and I start mixing this stuff, I usually just break off a big chunk of the beeswax and melt that down. And then I'll pour that into my jar, and then however much beeswax I have in the jar, I'll add equal parts of boiled linseed oil and turpentine to that mix. I just find it too difficult to worry about trying to accurately measure solid beeswax into equal portions and in any other way. So I have my beeswax melted. Take it out of the double boiler, and then I will pour it carefully into my jar. So there, I'm right about there. It doesn't really matter what you start with, and I'll carefully add my boiled linseed oil. Now, some people will just alter this recipe to their personal preferences, and that's perfectly fine. Some people like more BLO, some people like less, some people like more turpentine, some people like less. And then I'll add my turpentine. There we go. And then I'll take my stir stick, and it's going to start to solidify pretty quick. And you just want to make sure you stir it in all together. really well. And then all you have to do is, if that's the container you're going to keep it in, you're pretty much done. Otherwise, you can pour it into your storage container. This batch is for Captain Whitehall. There we go. And I'll just set that someplace nice and out of the way, and it'll solidify. And to show you some of the results that you can get from it, I'll take paper towel. I'll get some on here. And then I have a scrap piece of mahogany. So I'm just gonna rub it in there with a paper towel. And then the beeswax, if you let it sit for a few minutes, you could really buff it out into a nice luster. So if you have any questions or comments, please let us know down below. Thanks as always so much for liking, commenting, and subscribing. And we'll see you next time.